late. This is what I call a good audience. I'm not going to regale you with what happened since 8 o'clock this morning, my time, which is because I want to forget it myself. And I also, I'm not sure how to do this exactly. I think it seems to me that in view of the, lateness of the hour, it would make sense if you're willing to do what I often do in places that I go to a lot, and where they're used to it, and that is just dispense with the talk and start in with the discussion, which is always a lot more interesting and is more keyed to your interests. I mean, I could start talking about any number of things, but since it's late and, we want to get right to the heart of things, why don't you suggest what we ought to talk about?
Let's talk about whether we're going to have another Cuba invasion.
Another Cuba invasion? I don't think so, for a number of reasons. The main reason is that the guys who, the American business community is not in favor of it at this point, and they have plenty of clout. Now, it's conceivable that jingoist fanaticism will overwhelm, the interest of those who really run the country, but it doesn't look likely. I mean, what's happening in the case of Cuba is kind of like what happened in the case of Vietnam. The U.S. policy toward Cuba or Vietnam or Nicaragua is completely understandable. I mean, you simply have to think in terms of, say, some neighborhood in Chicago or maybe Vancouver, where the local mafia don is running the thing, and some storekeeper says he's not going to pay his protection money. Well, you don't just, you send your goons in and you get the money, but you don't stop there. You got to break his legs or kill him, or make sure that other people understand that that's not the kind of thing you do. And that's what's been driving U.S. policy. It's what drove U.S. The U.S. had basically won the war in Vietnam by the early 70s in any reasonable sense. But they didn't get maximal goals, but they got the main ones. But you have to show other people in the neighborhood that that's not the way you behave. So you have to really torture them. And they continued to torture them as long as they could, one excuse after another, each excuse more ridiculous than the last one, until something happened. Other people in the neighborhood stopped being intimidated and started going in, and the Japanese slowly moved in, and then the Europeans slowly moved in, and pretty soon the American business community, things got to the point where they recognized that, well, it's kind of useful and maybe even fun to torture people and kick them in the face. It's much more important to make money. And when you there comes a sort of transition point when you switch, and when that transition point came, all of a sudden it turned out that Vietnam was being forthcoming on the MIAs and making great progress in human rights and so on and so forth. So therefore American businesses could go in and get their share of the take. And that's pretty much what's happening in the case of Cuba, I think.
I've got a suggestion. We're constantly being bombarded by...
Is somebody talking?
Yeah, can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
We're constantly being bombarded by the media. It's almost a complete and total one line, and that is, we have to pay back our debt. I'm sure you're having the same thing in your country. There's the same thing in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe. Rarely in my life, and I'm over 50 now, have I seen such a universal, chorus that has, no dissenting voices. And I wondered if you might comment on that.
Yeah, it's not true that there's no dissenting. I mean, I don't want to talk about Canada. You know much more than me. But let me talk about the United States, where there is a dissenting voice, like, the overwhelming majority of the population. And you see that right now. Simply have a look at what's going on in the primaries. A couple of months, up to a few months ago, the top priority for both political parties was getting rid of the deficit and, balancing the budget and so on. That was the top priority for both parties. The only difference was whether you do it in, 7 years or 7 years and 2 months or something like that. The government kept being closed down over this for a couple of months. And in the press, headline, we got to balance the budget, Americans voted for a balanced budget, and so on. Anybody who'd been looking at the polls knew that this was total nonsense. The public was overwhelmingly opposed to this on any realistic grounds. If you looked at the polls, they were always they had two kind of questions. There was one question for the headline writers, and that question was, would you like to have a balanced budget? And on that, everybody says yes. I mean, I would say yes. It's like asking, would you like to have your household debts magically removed? Sure, But then when people were asked, would you like to have a balanced budget if, and then comes any realistic assumption, cuts in education or health or environmental protection or you name it, it quickly became overwhelmingly no. You couldn't, so the first question was for the guys who write the headlines or on National Public Radio and so on, but the questions down at the bottom, they were for the people who have to keep their finger on the public pulse, like the public relations industry and the propaganda system and everyone else. They have to know what people are thinking. You're going to try to control minds, you have to know where they are. So if you look at polls carefully, they give you a pretty realistic picture, as much as can be done, of because the business community needs to know that. And it was very clear what the attitudes were. So contrary to what you're saying, outside of elite circles, the articulate intellectuals, the political class, and so on, most people were opposed to it. And on very solid, and you can see that right now as soon as the primary started. The minute the primary started and people had to face the voters, the budget disappeared. Nobody's talking about it. Take a look at any of the campaigns. It is never mentioned. And the reason that it's never mentioned is, well, these guys have to face angry voters, so they better talk about something else, not what they're doing. In fact, nothing that they're doing ever reaches the voters. If you compare the campaign that's going on now with the congressional, the Gingrich Army proposals, they don't even overlap. There's no contact between them. And the budget is one dramatic example of this. It takes a lot of discipline for journalists and others not to notice this and to see what it means. But there's been like a sea change within, as soon as the primary season started, the budget dropped off the screen. You might ask a different question. Who's right? There's a question of fact, like is it important to balance the budget? So who's right, the instincts of the general population or the business community, which does want to do it? But of course they want to do it for very simple reasons. Balancing the budget is a weapon against social spending. So that's kind of irrelevant, but if you ask about it's not even hidden. They're not, for example, all the talk about budget balancing, some parts of the budget are going up. In fact, two parts are going up pretty fast, in fact. One is the Pentagon. Pentagon budget is at basically Cold War levels. Actually, it's higher than it was under Nixon, and there's no Russians around. So that tells you how seriously they took the Russian threat. But it's going up, and it's going up under pressure from the far right. The Heritage Foundation, Gingrich Republicans, and so on. They want it to go up. The public has an attitude on that too. The public is opposed to that by about 6-1. But the difference between public attitudes and public policy, which is always significant, has just become like a chasm. So that's one thing that's going up. The other thing that's going up is the other aspect. Incidentally, that's going up because it's the main function of the Pentagon, its main domestic function, has always been to transfer public funds to high-tech industry. Like that's how my salary gets paid, to be honest. MIT is part of that funnel where I work. It's part of the funnel by which the public unwittingly pays the costs of high-tech industry. And the whole of the modern economy, if you look through it, is crucially based on this. So the Pentagon has to not only stay, but in fact go up. The other part of the federal budget that's going up, state budgets too, is the other part of the security system, jails. Crime hasn't changed in about 20 years, at least if you can believe the FBI. But the perception of crime has changed radically, and that's propaganda. That's, I mean, it's the effect of propaganda to try to make people, crime is serious, but, you know, it's no more serious than it was 30 years ago. And the people who are scared are not the ones who are harmed by it. Crime mostly harms the poor. It's mostly poor people harming each other, and they're not the ones who are saying, let's build more jails. The propaganda about crime, like the propaganda about drugs, is a technique of population control. For one thing, it targets a superfluous population. It targets people you want to get rid of, like the kind of people who in, say, Colombia, you send the death squads after. They're kind of superfluous. And it, in fact, it's very carefully shaped, the whole crime story, to attack black males, primarily. So if you look at the population of black males, they're being devastated by this, and it was specifically targeted for them. There's virtually no doubt about it. So on the one hand, it has that effect. And the race-class correlation is close enough. It's not perfect, but it's close enough in the United States, so you're also going after poor working people this way. People you really don't want around, like, you know, the people you send out to into the desert or kill or something in less civilized countries than ours. So while crime is, and the other thing it's doing is scaring everybody else. Well, that's a technique of population control. If you're kicking people in the face, you're harming them, and most people are getting harmed by social policy, you want them to think about something else. And you want to be afraid of something, like the Jews or the homosexuals or somebody or other. Everybody hits the same technique because there aren't a lot of techniques around. And in this case, one way of terrifying the population is crime. The other is crazed Arabs and, you know, all sorts of other things, but crime right at home is a good one. So since if you go back to 1980, the U.S. was kind of at the high end of the industrial world in incarceration, but now it's off the spectrum. During the Reagan years, the number of prisoners tripled without any change in the crime rate, and under Bush and Clinton, and now it's going up even faster. We long ago left South Africa behind. Russia was left behind a long time ago. Actually, Russia caught up for a while after the reforms started, and it began to understand how to behave. But now we've passed Russia again, and we're just off the scale in terms of per capita incarceration, and it's still going up. Well, that's that has a lot of effect. I mean, it's gotten to the point where, incidentally, crime rates in the United States are not particularly, they're high, but not unusually high. So if you compare the United States with other industrial countries, again, the U.S. is kind of at the high end, but not, actually, I don't even think it's first in anything. There's one crime in which the United States really is totally by itself, and that's homicide with guns. But that has nothing to do with crime. You know, that's because of the crazy gun culture. So like if there's domestic, where it would be domestic, you know, like a domestic problem in some other country ends up somebody getting murdered in the United States because there are guns all over the place. But if you take that aside, you look at, you know, robberies, rapes, you know, car thefts or whatever, the U.S. is at the high end, but not unusually so. On the other hand, the rate of incarceration, which was not very different from other industrial countries around 1980, is now radically different. And that's that's really a reflection of social policy. It's kind of comparable to the fact that, say, inequality in the U.S., which was at the high end of the industrial world, but in the spectrum around 1980, is now off the scale. All these things are aspects of the same kinds of social policy. Now, the security system is going up very fast. You hear a lot of talk about, I'm a little off your topic, but I'll get back to it. You hear a lot of talk about how if you project health expenses, it'll bankrupt the country. Well, you know, that's mostly nonsense. But the fact is, if you want to play that game, if you project prison building, that'll bankrupt the country even faster. In fact, the RAND Corporation did a study a year or two ago in which they pointed out that at the rate at which California was imprisoning people by some, I don't know, year 2000 or something like that, they would have nothing left in the state budget for education. Everything would have to be going to prisons. And that's the kind of projection you get. Well, let's come back. Why is this going on? Well, it's kind of like the Pentagon. For one thing, it has a function. It does have the function of use of force. I mean, in the case of the Pentagon, you know, keeps the world under control. In the case of the security system, it's kind of like social cleansing in Colombia, as well as controlling the rest of the population by frightening them. But like the Pentagon, it has another function. It is a by now rather significant Keynesian stimulus for the economy. I mean, it's gotten to the point where rural counties, which is where most of the prisons go, are competing for prisons because money for the construction industry, and the security guard maybe still is the fastest growing white collar profession in the United States. Plus, there's big money involved. They're getting privatized, and running a federal prison can be very lucrative. I mean, some of these companies are now, quite wealthy. In fact, it's gotten to the point where even high-tech industry is noticing. They figure they may have another scam alongside the Pentagon to feed off public funds. So it got to the point where the Wall Street Journal, about 2 years ago or so, had an article discussing the opportunities for high-tech industry to get into the security business. You know, you implant electrodes in people, and you have supercomputers, having them under surveillance and so on. It's not crazier than, shooting down missiles in outer space or something like that. These are all kind of covers for getting new technology funded, and while this is nowhere near the scale of the Pentagon, it's noticeable. The big investment firms like Merrill Lynch and so on are floating tax-free bonds for prison construction. So it's into big business. So here's these are the two parts of the state system, which are in fact growing, which again tells you something about how much they want to balance the budget. Well, the budget balancing has to be very carefully honed. It has to be used as a weapon against any part of the government system that goes to other than the rich. The part that goes to the rich, that goes up, or the part that's there for population control, that part of the budget goes up. Well, coming back to the first question, who's right from an economic point of view about the effect, about balancing the budget? Like, just how important is it? Should one think it's an important thing to do? The public thinks it isn't. The business world thinks it is, but for reasons that are irrelevant. Irrelevant on economic grounds, at least. But if you ask on economic grounds, is it the right thing to do, what's the answer? Well, first of all, a qualification has to be made right off. On any such question, almost nobody knows anything. So almost everything that's said is guesswork. Any honest economist will tell you that if you tell him the answer you want, he'll construct a model to give you that answer. Within a pretty big range. And in fact, most of these things are sort of large. There is some knowledge, but a large part of it is historical evidence and sort of judgment questions and so on. So whose judgment is right? Well, there's some. First of all, take say the United States, is the debt high? Well, not by historical standards. In fact, it's about what it was in the late 50s, and considerably less relative to GDP, national economy, which is the only relevant measure. It's less than it was, say, in the early 50s. In fact, it's much less than it was during the biggest growth period after World War II. And historically, that's about what it's been. The U.S. has always run a big debt. It kept turning over. It used the debt to invest and pay off the debt through growth and also cutting it back through inflation. Up until throughout the whole 19th century, during the really big growth periods, the U.S. had very higher debt than it has now. So you can't argue that somehow the debt is out of sight. I mean, it did grow very fast during the Reagan years. In fact, most of the debt is Reagan debt. But that was, again, to cut social spending. And it's substantial because of the Reagan years, but not by historical standards, certainly not out of line by historical standards. In fact, I think the U.S. deficit is not debt, remember, the U.S. deficit is now the lowest in the OECD relative to the economy. right alongside Japan. I forget which one's lower, but the U.S. and Japan, I think, are the two lowest in the industrial world relative to the economy. So it's not, no major, it's like some catastrophe or something. It's well within historical range and not even noticeable particularly. Furthermore, there's also evidence about the effect of running deficits. There have been a couple of times, I think about half a dozen times in American history, when there has been an attempt to balance the budget. And in fact, every single one of them has led pretty quickly to either recession or deep depression. On the other hand, here it gets tricky, but there are some studies, the only studies that have been done, as far as I know, most of them done by an economist named Robert Eisner at Northwestern, which have been attempts to estimate, to try to work out the effect of a deficit on things like investment, growth, anything you can measure. It turns out there's a not huge, but somewhat positive effect to running deficits. And the reason is not very surprising. After all, every business runs deficits all the time. Every business is in debt. Every household is in debt. Everything that functions is in debt all the time. You're in debt because you're trying to do something. Now, of course, if you use, debt is neither good nor bad. I mean, if you use the debt to, gamble at Las Vegas, it was a bad debt. If you use the debt to, to send your kids to college or, buy a car or start a business or something, then it can be a good debt, okay, from the point of view of economic gain and other things. It depends what you do with it. And if the borrowing is used intelligent, for example, if government borrowing goes into building infrastructure and improving education and health and so on, so there's a more viable society down the road, there'll also be more growth, more income, you pay off the debt. That's what matters. What matters is wise investment in people's lives and the way they live and what's produced and so on and so forth. And of course, wise investment is going to involve debt. Public spending is, in fact, a major way in which any economy grows. Sometimes in a healthy way, sometimes in a destructive way. It depends what you do with it. So as far as we know, at least, there's no big imperative about cutting the debt. I mean, obviously, it depends. Despite the Reagan years, which did, they did turn the United States very quickly from the world's biggest creditor into the world's biggest debtor very fast. But that was because of a combination of massive spending, massive state spending, and tremendous borrowing. There was kind of like a borrow and spend abandon in the Reagan years. And mainly, as David Stockman said right at the beginning, there's no secret, the head of the budget, because if they figured if they get deep enough into debt, there'll be a straitjacket and they'll be able to kill social spending. Well, okay, if that's your goal, then that's a good thing. And if you can use cutting the debt to achieve that goal, then that's fine. But for the general population, that doesn't make any sense at all. And even on narrow economic grounds, it's very dubious that it makes any sense, probably harmful on the narrowest economic grounds. Now, in Canada, the answer to that may be different. Remember, take the talk about how the debt is a burden on future generations. Well, in the United States, that's simply not true. The debt is mostly owned by Americans, which means that the payments on the debt stay right in the country. Now, it may have a redistributive effect, like it's probably the case, although even this is pretty hard to show because of pension funds and everything else. But it's, you guess that it's the case that richer people hold more of the debt than poorer people, proportional income. But if that's true, then the debt will indeed have a redistributive effect, in fact, a regressive redistributive effect, although even that's challenged. But that you take care of by other means, like, say, more progressive taxation. So those are not big social problems. I mean, there's nothing unworkable about the social problems. The debt the payment on the debt just almost all stays inside the country, just gets reshuffled around in complicated ways. So there's no burden on future generations. I mean, the burden on future generations is if you don't leave them with a viable society. Like if your children and your grandchildren are going to go into society which doesn't have roads and bridges and people aren't educated and people are dying of diseases and so on and so forth, yeah, then there isn't going to, it's not going to be a nice life for them, and in fact they won't be able to maintain anything like the lifestyle people have now. But in order to achieve those goals, to create a viable society, public spending is absolutely a necessity. Furthermore, the business community knows it. That's why they insist on the Pentagon staying high, because that's the form of public spending they like. They don't call it public spending, but that's a method whereby the general public pays the costs of research and development and so on, and basically, creates the high-tech system, which is then handed over, and not just engineering and so on, same is true of biotechnology and everything else. Hard to find a dynamic sector of the economy where that hasn't been a major factor. So yeah, there is that kind of public spending, but what about the other kind? I mean, what about, helping develop a society in which a human being would want to live? Would want to live and would want to work and would want to work productively and so on and so forth. Well, that's public responsibility. Now, how that I think it's not a great idea to have that public responsibility fulfilled through a powerful central government. In fact, I think it's a rotten idea. But under current circumstances, it happens to be the only alternative to having private tyrannies run everything, which is far worse. So given the options, that's the best one, I think. But that means, and I think most people kind of sense this, and that's, or at least at some level sense it, which is why you don't have support for balancing the budget. And to get back to your original question, it's why as soon as candidates have to face the public, they drop it like a hot potato. So it's only the business world and its various flacks who say that we have to balance the budget. Not many other people do.
I work for a union that represents a lot of people in Canadian newspapers and radio and television. One of the things we see occurring is a fragmentation, particularly of the advertising market, but also of the circulation and the viewers of this media. And I wonder if you agree with that and what implications it has for that idea of having agenda-setting media, necessary to have mass media that are important media that are agenda-setting. And the other, does fragmentation offer us opportunities in terms of alternative media and being able to get a message out? How do you?
Well, I don't know the details about Canada, though I can't imagine it's very different from the United States and other countries. And the main tendency is towards mega mergers. So the number of separate, I hate to say independent because they're all more or less the same anyway, but the number of separate news sources has been declining for a long time. And it's declining even more now, like when you start getting, Disney, ABC, or whatever it is. All of these things are turning into real mega mergers, and this is just part of what's going on in the business world altogether. There's a big move towards kind of mega corporations. There's a big merger frenzy now. It's partly because there's so much financial capital floating around. It's pretty destructive for the economy, but that's the way things are going. And it's pretty strikingly true in the media as well. Even internationally. So like I just came back from India a couple of weeks ago, and the big question there is whether the media, which are pretty right-wing by and large, should they resist takeovers by Murdoch and guys like that, which will happen if they do what's called liberalizing the economy. Liberalizing the economy means letting the guys with really big money do everything and kick everybody else out, because that's the way markets work. So should they sort of give away the Indian media to Murdoch and Conrad Black and these other characters, and the big empires that they run, like ultimately major corporations like Disney and Warner and so on. Now, another part of that is cutting back on news. So it's perfectly true that news coverage is being cut back. News offices are being cut back. There is less coverage, but that's kind of like it's like the reason I'm late today. Which has nothing to do with the weather. It had to do, I think, ultimately had to do with deregulation of the airlines. If you go back far enough, one effect of deregulation of the airlines has been to transfer costs to the public. In fact, a lot of automation has that character. Automation, you know, they tell you it's saving money. It certainly is saving money for businesses. But if you think about it, it's transferring the costs, and you know it very well. I just asked about your own experiences. You have to go to you call the newspaper to get your subscription changed or something, or call an airline to get a reservation. Well, you know, they carry you through a lot of, you have to go through a menu, and you push buttons, and you wait, and they play pretty music, and you have to have a book, because it's going to take you half an hour to get through. And the same is true of just the way the airline industry is run. The seats are closer, they don't take care of the planes, you try to keep right at the margin because you can make more profit. And all of that does make more profit, but it just transfers the costs. I mean, as far as the economy is concerned, nobody measures the costs to human beings, so you can't get a number. But it's not clear that, that it's not even clear that the benefits of automation outweigh the costs, if you think about this. Well, that's part of the reason for cutting back news. You can get a bigger advertising budget if it's I don't know, gory murder or something like that, or whatever people watch, than if it's a news program. The advertisers aren't that much interested in advertising on the news programs. So therefore, just partly advertiser-driven and partly for other reasons, news is and commentary and discussion and that sort of thing is being cut back. Also, news and commentary and discussion have a kind of a dangerous aspect to them. They are, to some extent, democratizing. That is, they tend, to some extent at least, to get people involved in what's going on. And the goal is to keep people atomized, keep them out of the public arena. So let's have them watch, one of these shows where people talk about their personal lives or something. Then they're not going to be in trouble at all. Then they're just going to become atoms of consumption, the sort of utopia. On the other hand, to get back to, but remember, there is a sector of the population that does have to have information and knowledge and so on. The management classes, decision-making classes, the ownership classes. And the real elite press, I don't think it's changing very much for them, like the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times and the Washington Post. And that sector, I don't think is really going to change much. Because they go to and they are the agenda-setting media. On the other hand, the rest of the media, they may very well go the way of, say, the tabloids, the Mirror and the Sun. Take, say, Britain, where back in the 1960s, the two big tabloids, the Mirror and the Sun, they were labor papers with a lot of craziness, women with two heads and that sort of business, but a lot of news and information and a kind of social democratic point of view on the world and labor-oriented and so on. Now it's just like, the National Enquirer, the thing that you watch for laughs when you're going out at the supermarket. Plus the racing forums and whatever else you can sort of manipulate people with once you've driven any out of their heads any idea of solidarity and cooperation and working for a better life or getting involved in the political system and so on. So that I suppose will continue, and because unless people like us and others like us stop it. But the natural tendency would be for it to go in that direction. So it's a kind of fragmentation, but I think it'll leave the agenda-setting media, the elite media, not all that different, because they do serve a function, the indoctrination function, and also just the informing function for the decision-making sectors of the population. How about alternatives? Well, there are plenty of alternatives opening up, and unfortunately, they haven't. I think people like us haven't used them. I'm going to say, take cable television. That has allowed for some years now plenty of options. The way the laws work in the United States, at least, communities, in order to get a cable contract, say, Warner Brothers or one of those guys, has to commit to, in a particular, say in Boston, they have to commit some resources to community cable, which means that places like Cambridge and Chelsea and Somerville, the little towns around, They actually have cable stations with equipment and things that people could do something with, and they're just not used. I mean, they are not going to, they're not going to be on the scale of the networks, but they are ways to reach people. And if they're not being used, it's our fault. There are ways to do it. Some people do, but nowhere near what has been possible. And the same is true of other kinds of information technology. It allows a lot of options. And I think it's been used, and that's partly because the left and the labor movement have abandoned a lot of the turf that they ought to be developing. There's a lot of soul searching that ought to be done, in my opinion, about these matters. I mean, sure, there's big forces out there that are trying to destroy you, but there's a lot of opportunities that aren't being taken. The new telecommunications stuff is another case in point. It's going to be interesting. On how that develops is going to make a big difference. Like the rest of high tech, it was all publicly funded. So the telecommunications systems, including the internet and everything else, ought to be publicly run because they were funded by the public, mostly through the Pentagon system, the way everything else goes. Now, of course, by now, like say computers or airplanes or anything else, what's called private enterprise, meaning publicly subsidized public-private profit enterprise, what we call free enterprise, they want to take it over, just like they took over radio and television and print and everything else. And they tell you what they're going to do with it. I mean, it's not a big secret. They want to turn it into more ways of atomizing and marginalizing people and making them more stupid and ignorant and passive and obedient and so on. So turn it into a home shopping service, say, or some other form of Actually, I remember an article a couple of years ago. I think it was in the Wall Street Journal or somewhere, where they were describing the fantastic potential of the internet because interactive, or all the interactive stuff. And the idea sort of was like this from memory. By now I may be remembering my retelling of the story, but it was something like this. The population was broken up into two categories, women and men. And for women, it would be a home shopping service. So you're sitting there looking at the screen, alone, of course, not talking to anybody. You're sitting alone in a dark room looking at the screen, just you and the PR industry. And something is shown on the screen which you don't want, but of course the whole advertising industry is designed to create, and has been for hundreds of years, to design and create wants, to make you think I gotta have that or else something terrible will happen, like, I won't look like the model or whatever you're supposed to be. So all this stuff pours in at you, maybe to children and certainly to women, and they're going to be trapped into wants. But since it's interactive, you don't even have to go to the store. You just push a button and, pretty soon something arrives at your door or something. So that's for women. What about for men? Well, for men, they had a different idea, also using the interactive character. Every red-blooded American male is supposed to be sitting with a six-pack watching the professional football games, alone, of course. That's very important. The way it is now, you can just sort of watch and cheer and scream and, yell at the coach or whatever you do. But since this is interactive, it's now going to be possible to ask the whole, 150 million man audience what they think the next play ought to be. Like, do you think it ought to be a pass or, a kick or something or other? And everybody will be able to push a button and say what they think it ought to be. And then it doesn't have any effect on what happens. Then the play is what it is. But they will then put on the screen, 68% said it ought to be a pass. And so that's the interactive technology for men. And for women, it's home shopping, and for children, it's just, trap them and destroy their minds and so on. Yeah, sure, that's what, that would make perfect sense. I mean, if you were a high-paid PR, in some public relations office, isn't that what you would be thinking? I mean, that's what you ought to be doing. So it could become that, or one variant of that, or other, or it could be something that really does bring people together in certain ways. I think it's double-edged, even the good side of it. because at best it's bringing separated people together in a medium that doesn't involve personal interaction. So like we're human beings, you know, we're not from Mars or something. And there's a big difference between face-to-face contact and virtual reality, you know, contacting somebody somewhere who maybe doesn't exist except in your mind and so on. That has its negative side even at best. On the other hand, it is a way of, and has been used pretty efficiently in fact, to mobilize people, to get information to them they wouldn't get otherwise. It's been a spur to significant action. Actually, take, say, East Timor, which is something I've been working on for years. The change in the scale of the popular movement after the technology came in is very dramatic. I mean, before that, it was a matter of waiting for your friends in Australia to mail you some clippings. Now, lots of information is around very fast, and people are doing good things with it. And this is largely because a few people, like Charlie Shiner and White Plains, are using it intelligently. It can be done, and it can have a positive effect, and there are a lot of things like that. So it's, you know, what happens to it is going to depend on the interaction of corporate power and popular forces. And I don't think it's predictable any more than it was predictable, say, with radio or television or cable or anything else. It's something that can be worked on. So are there other alternatives? Plenty of them. I mean, for example, now it's possible to, with desktop publishing, it's possible to publish extremely cheaply. Something like, say, Z Magazine is published literally by 2 people. It would have taken a big staff and, you know, angels and so on and so forth just a couple of years ago. And in fact, for the third world, the technology is incredible. It sounds high tech, but in fact, for third world countries, desktop publishing is a dream. It's very cheap. It's way cheaper than printing presses and all this sort of thing. And it enables a few people to do it even in their spare time sometimes. And the same is true here. It offers lots of possibilities. And I think that's true of technology in general. It really offers lots of possibilities. Depends who's got their hand on the lever.
To what extent is General Electric influencing American nuclear weapons policy?
General Electric and nuclear weapons policy? I don't know. I mean, I don't think they care much, to tell you the truth. I mean, as long as, in fact, take, say, nuclear power. Right now, they're not interested in pushing it very much. And the reason is it's not cost effective. On nuclear weapons policy, I frankly doubt that the board of directors of GE cares a lot one way or another. I may be wrong, but I don't see why they should care.
Well, we were just talking about it in school, and we learned that they do influence.
Sorry?
We were talking about that issue in school, and we learned that they do influence.
Sorry, I can't.
They are influencing foreign policy. I mean...
GE?
Yeah.
Oh, they're influencing foreign policy.
No, sorry, not foreign policy, but nuclear weapons policy. And that they have a big nuclear weapons industry.
Well, part of the way, and they certainly are, not only GE, but lots of other corporations are part of the nuclear system and make money from it and so on and so forth. But I really don't think it's a major issue for them now. I mean, they don't care about the nuclear weapons. What they might care about is nuclear power. But right now, that, for just business reasons, doesn't look very cost effective. Remember that oil, the price of oil is now down to about what it was in the 50s. It's very cheap now. In fact, it is part of the reason for the sanctions on Iraq, just to keep more oil from getting into the market, because so they don't want the price to go down too low. If the price goes down too low, it starts harming the American economy, because the energy companies are American and a lot of money pours in, and you recycle petrodollars. So it's always been, there's always been an effort to try to keep oil prices within a certain band, not too high, not too low. Now they're getting too low. But one effect of that is that, one consequence of that is that nuclear power is not economical. And as far as I'm aware, at least, the big corporations are not all that interested in pushing it. You can even see cutbacks, and rather significant cutbacks in funding for the longer term possible, you know, for the longer term possibilities for nuclear power, like the, you know, the whole, I mean, things that are on the border are being cut back. The big reactors, fission research, stuff like that, which simply means that the big corporations right now don't see it as a high priority, I think. They may change their mind, but, you know, I'm really speculating. I don't have any more information about it than you do, but I don't see why they should be much interested in nuclear weapons policy. And I'm not aware of anything specific.
Good evening. My name is Corky Day, and I've long worked in the alternative media. Bill asked earlier if the fragmentation of the media could be good. You said the situation was more of concentration of the media. But in the alternative media, we are being fragmented. Aren't we, as alternative journalists, spreading ourselves too thinly? And wouldn't we be better off with fewer but stronger and bigger alternative periodicals?
Well, I didn't realize that the question was about alternative media. I thought it was about the mainstream media. So
well, it may have been, but I...
Yeah, okay. Well, let's talk about the alternative media. Well, there is plenty of fragmentation, but now let's see if we're on the same wavelength. I mean, one thing that's going on is a lot of very local, very special issues sort of things, which don't interact much with one another. That kind of fragmentation, you know, may reflect something that's at some level healthy, that is interest in a wide range of things, but I don't think it's a very healthy phenomenon in general. I think that's in fact why you're getting things like the Buchanan phenomenon. It's part of the core concerns of a great many people, and rightfully, have been sort of abandoned by fragmentation of special interests on the left. If that's what you mean, I think it's something to worry about. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, that's part of, right. In fact, I strongly agree with that. That's why somebody like Buchanan can come in and pick, you know, just basically pick up slogans that he's taken from the left and turn them into a monstrosity, because the people who ought to be doing it aren't. There are many of them engaged. There are many of them, and they're engaged in good things, but very narrowly focused often, and off the main track of most people's concerns. Now, that's a problem. I think it's been a significant problem. I've written about it for quite a while and spoken about it a lot myself, but I've felt for a long time that that's a serious problem, and one that people who regard themselves, you know, who feel that, you know, they're part of the effort to extend justice and freedom and things that are called the left, they ought to really be worried about and thinking about.
So are you encouraging them to get together more?
Well, you know, only in the sense that I'm trying to do it now. I mean, I think it's a dangerous tendency, and you got to overcome it from within. So yes, if that's encouraging, sure. I think
it would seem to me that are you satisfied?
No.
I mean, you know, I don't, like, I'm not suggesting a party line or anything. I don't want to encourage in that sense, but I do think it's a question of fundamental importance, and I think the left has very much harmed itself by not taking it seriously, and is causing serious harm in the society at large, of which something like the Buchanan phenomenon is a reflection. I mean, there was a section of the Nazis that did the same thing. You know, the left wing of the Nazis had slogans of the left, and may well have meant them, but they worked them into this crazed, more general system. And that's what you find in the Buchanan phenomenon. He really is appealing to people, to many people, on issues that they have every right to be concerned about. And nobody else is talking any sense to them. So they'll listen to this crazy stuff.
It would seem to me that public education is a major tool, could be a potential major tool for manufacturing consent, to use the term.
Or dissent, you know. It's kind of like technology. It depends what you do with it.
Yes.
I mean, the public education system, at least in the United States, was set up pretty much as a socializing system. It was really set up primarily to sort of take independent farmers and put them into factories, something almost like that. Actually, Emerson once said, we're educating them to keep them from leaping at our throats and strangling us, which is what they might do if they knew what's going on, something like that. But it doesn't have to be like that. Public education can be very liberating.
And here in BC, we're looking at cutting back charter school funding and homeschoolers from minimal to none. And while the public education system, by the latest poll by the Ministry of Education, shows that 4.2% of grade 12 graduates feel uncared for, and where 11.2% of grade 12 graduates feel that what they're learning is irrelevant. What are the dangers in cutting back education funding to so-called alternatives that want to pop up?
What kind of alternatives do you mean?
Anything from something like the Sudbury Valley School to
private schools
to private Catholic schools. I mean,
well, you know, there's kind of like a fundamental point to face, and that is, as human beings, do we only care that, am I supposed to only care that my children get educated, or am I supposed to care that the kids down the street get educated? Now, that's a question that goes across the board on every issue. There is a very powerful, extraordinarily powerful part of the entire sort of capitalist ideology is making you worry only about yourself, lose any connection to other people, destroy solidarity, just leave solidarity in the hands of the investing class. The rest of you just worry about yourself. This goes way back. You read the working class press in 1850 around the places like where I live, which was around New England, which was the center of the early Industrial Revolution. It was a very lively working class press run by mechanics and what they call factory girls, young women off the farms and so on. Very interesting reading, but one of the things that they were denouncing was exactly this tendency, what they called the new spirit of the age, gain wealth, forgetting all but self, which they regarded as degrading and demeaning and destroying, their human values and so on, correctly. In fact, the labor movement throughout its whole history has been fighting against this. Work together, because we're all in it together. We want to help each other. That's a very different ethic. That's just a traditional ethic. It took modern capitalism to even question it. And I think that what questions it is very anti-human. Well, that shows up in connection with the schools. It comes down to the question, do I care whether the kids down the street get an education? Well, I think we should. I think we should care that but notice, that means public education. In fact, I think that's the major motive for public education. It's like public health. It's like a public health system. Do I care that the kids down the street have sewage? Okay, well, same question. Why not just me? I should have sewage, and they should have a hole out in the backyard. Well, that's a question of what kind of a world you want to live in. Do you want to live in a world where people care for each other, care about each other? I think we ought to live for that kind of a world. But then that some form of community education, whatever you call it, is part of that. It means that children ought to have the best opportunities they can have and the best chance for developing their own powers that they can get, whether they're my kids or somebody else's kids. And the whole move towards vouchers and privatization and so on is, as far as I can see, like trying to privatize healthcare, which says, well, who cares if they're healthy down there as long as I'm rich enough to buy healthcare for myself? I think it's a very dangerous tendency.
So are you saying you support public education?
Do I support it?
It's good as I think it's good as it's socialized, but it's the same as with Medicare. It's like you're given their choice. Like
whose choice?
You have to like go to this school and learn these things. I totally.
Well, that's different. Yeah, but see, but that's look. I mean, you could ask the same about Medicare. I mean,
you should be able to make a choice.
what kind of a choice? Each individual. Yeah. So a community system or a public system should have plenty of choices.
Like I send my daughter to an alternative school, and I have to pay $200 a month because it doesn't get funded, and I think I should be able to choose what kind of school I send her to.
Yeah.
And it's the same, but it's the same with healthcare. I can get healthcare covered if I go to a medical doctor, but if I go to a naturopathic doctor, the visit gets covered, but my herbs or anything. So it's like, okay, well, we have this socialized education and socialized healthcare, but only if we pick what we want.
But that's what a democratic society and a free society of cooperating people ought to allow options. If you're only given the choice of everybody's kids go to a factory called a school, or else I make choices for them, well, that's not a very good set of choices. But I think we ought to be working for a public education system that, that really does provide opportunities and options and freedom and so on, up to some limit. I mean, you can't, and the limit has to be determined by a community. Incidentally, one of my kids I ended up sending to a private school too, though I'm not in favor of it. Just because.
She doesn't go to a private school. It's like a no curriculum, child run.
Yeah, well, one of my daughters actually ended up going to a friend's school, which is about as close to that as you can get in the Boston area. But that was for, I wasn't happy about it, but for various reasons. Given the options within the public school system, we just felt we had to do it. So I'm not saying that these are easy personal choices. Given bad options, they're not, and the same is true of health. I know that if one of my kids, let's say, really needed expensive health care and you couldn't get it through the public system, I'd find a way to pay for it myself, though I don't think that ought to happen. Well, it's because we're given a set of bad choices. So within the set of bad choices, I think the thing to do is try to make them better, not eliminate the good things because some aspects of the good things aren't working. I mean, in a way, it's like, anything you point to is going to be like that. Every institution that exists is distorted by concentration of power and many other things. Fine, so you try to overcome those distorting effects, but you don't throw away whatever is useful about institutions. You say something about the labor movement. I mean, the labor movement, I think, has been over the years, has been a major force in democratization and improving people's lives and so on and so forth. On the other hand, it's crooked as hell, all involved with gangsters and so on and so forth. Well, okay, so instead of saying, okay, let's throw out the labor movement, what you say is let's get rid of that aspect of it, make it more responsive to workers.
There's been a lot of...
Yeah, okay, let's and wait a minute, but I think, I think it's better to keep to the mic. Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut off the previous speaker. I have a question. There's been a lot of discussion lately about the fact that corporate profits have been rising, while at the same time, layoffs of employees have been going up as well. And recently, the Secretary of Labor in the U.S. and the Minister of Industry in Canada have both made, fairly tepid comments about the conduct of corporations laying off workers when their profits are skyrocketing. And I just want to hear your comments on that.
Well, first of all, layoffs is the least of it. I mean, for about 20 years now, wages in the United States, again, I only know the detailed figures for the United States and Europe. I don't know them for Canada. But in the United States, at least, let me talk about that. I don't think it's much different here. Around the early 70s, wages started to real income started to stagnate. And by around 1980, it started to decline. If you take the median wage, half below, half above, it's been declining fairly steadily since around 1980. That continued right through the Clinton recovery. The Clinton years, the recovery was, in fact, the growth was faster than during the Reagan years. but it was unprecedented in that wages kept going down. So I think something like, if I remember, 95% or so of families, some very high number, lost family income from 1989, when the recession started, through 1993, which is after the recovery, and it's the last year for which we have figures, and it's probably still going down. For what they call unskilled workers, which means like 70 to 75% of the workforce, they've lost about 20% or so of income since about 1980. That's the core of this, angry white male phenomena and so on, what Buchanan's appealing to. For college graduates, wages started going down around 1987 after the full effect of the Reaganite social changes hit, and they're still going down. So layoffs is one aspect of it, but the other aspect is just a general collapse, a general attack on working people across a very broad spectrum. And at the same time, corporate profits are just breaking all records. And if you read Fortune and Business Week and so on, they can't even find the adjectives anymore to describe how stupendous and dazzling and so on it is. Last year, Fortune magazine, the big business magazine, every May has an issue devoted to the Fortune 500, the top 500 corporations. And the one last May was really pretty impressive. I mean, they couldn't get over how fantastic it was. Fourth straight year of double-digit profit growth, 54% profit growth last year. They expect it to continue after 4 years of it. So the country is just flooded with capital. It's not lean and mean or anything like that. Absolutely flooded with capital, more and more narrowly concentrated, while for most of the population it's either stagnation or decline. Well, layoffs is one aspect of that happens to be hitting the newspapers now, but it's a pretty small aspect of the whole picture. Well, that's, these are the results of very definite social policy, back starting in the early 70s. Pretty powerful new weapons were placed into the hands of private tyrannies, what we call private business, which are just big totalitarian institutions. Basically unaccountable ones, and they got a lot of new weapons to beat people over the head with. And by the main one being the huge explosion of financial markets, which has just been extraordinary in scale. And that's had an enormous effect. I mean, I'll give you some of the numbers if you like. They're really mind-boggling. The effects were already understood by the late 70s, pretty well understood, that this was going to drive down growth rates, concentrate wealth, lead to a kind of low-wage, low-growth, high-profit equilibrium. But that's only part of it. Another aspect of it is that there is now tremendous pressure from financial markets, big money managers, who have huge amounts of capital in their hands and can move it around very fast. One effect of contemporary telecommunications is you can take, say, the whole New York banking system and put it in Tokyo every day, so you can use the financial markets over there and make a little more money, and then use them over here and make a little more money. I mean, that's why you have, it takes, say, MIT, science engineering school. There are corporate recruiters that come around every, May, June to try to pick up the smart guys in the science and engineering, the PhDs. Last year, 25% of them were from Wall Street, corporate recruiters. They were going after math and physics PhDs. These guys don't know anything about Wall Street, but they're smart guys who know how to work out complicated scams that'll enable you to get a tiny bit more profit by, some intricate device in speculative markets. That's having a huge effect on the international economy and the domestic economy. For example, it's forcing corporations to move toward, say, a manager, a guy who's doing the actual, the guys in a management position in a corporation, let's say the CEO or the guys in the board of directors. It's forcing them to look for very short-term profit. Because if they don't go for very short-term profit, there's going to be a rapid exit of capital to somewhere else which is getting short-term profit. And that's having I don't think anybody's worked it out yet, but there's a general assessment that this is having a very harmful effect on the economy altogether. Just as the rapid transfer of the enormous growth of capital that's used for speculation against currencies is also having a tremendous effect. It moves towards, it attacks any country, even a big country like the United States that tried to introduce stimulative measures. Capital would flow out of it really fast because this capital does not want growth. What they want is stable currencies, and growth can threaten stable currencies. So they want low growth, stable currencies, no inflation, tremendous profits, and wages going down. And at home, you're getting pressures against, private enterprise never does much long-term planning, but whatever there is, there's pressure against it because you want to make sure that you have high profits the next quarter, or else you're going to lose the capital that can move around very fast now. So these things are having big effects. And they started around the early 70s and have been expanding ever since. And there are others, what they call globalization, the huge, there's been a considerable escalation of transnationals and so on and so forth, and in different ways than in the past. They're doing different things than they used to do. They've always been around. All of these are putting very powerful weapons into the hands of private power, and they're using it to try to unravel the social contract that has been established after lots of struggle. Big attack on labor, incidentally, is part of it. So in the United States, as you know, unionization has gone way down, but it isn't, a large part of that is, I don't like the term conspiracy, and I don't use it much, but this is real conspiracy. There was a state corporate conspiracy in the 80s, very blatant state corporate conspiracy to destroy unions. Now, corporations have always wanted to destroy unions, but state power in the 80s essentially authorized it, and pretty openly. The only place where I've seen really good reviews of this is in the business press, which are very frank about it. Business Week, for example, had very good stories about it. How the government basically told the private sector from the early 80s, they're simply not going to enforce the laws. So do what you like, And in fact, the number of illegal firings of organizers shot up. I think it went up by like a factor of 6 or something. Corporations were told that OSHA, the Safety and Health, or Office of Safety and Health, something or other, the government office that looks after safety and health standards, would simply not enforce standards. And in fact, the number of days, the number of working days lost to injury went up by about 50% very quickly. And that's across the board. Illegal firings, the use of, it has been technically legal in the United States since the late 30s to use permanent replacement workers. The United States may be one of the few industrial countries where this is even on the books, but it's after the Wagner Act was passed in 1935, which for the first time gave workers the right to organize that they had in just about every other industrial country. The Supreme Court very quickly undercut it within a few years and technically allowed the right to hire permanent replacement workers, which is much worse than scabs, notice. But the balance of forces was such that the major corporations could never do it. They never thought of doing it. Well, by the late 80s, they started thinking of doing it. And the first big manufacturing corporation to do it was Caterpillar. That was part of a major union-busting strategy, and right at the center of the heartland of working-class America, Decatur, Illinois, big working-class town, 3 major unions, the biggest unions, and there was a big corporate attack on them, 3 transnationals, 1 British, 1 Japanese, and 1 Caterpillar, US-based, and they just wanted to destroy the unions very openly. They used the huge profits. They used their excess capacity overseas. Like Caterpillar explained its business strategy, at least in the business press. They said that they're going to force workers to capitulate because they've used their enormous profits to build excess capacity overseas, like in Brazil and so on, which allows them to fill their international markets even if they don't produce here. Plus permanent replacement workers here, and a lot of huge growth in temporary workers, to no benefits, all that kind of stuff. Well, these weapons, actually the United States was actually censured by the International Labor Organization, which is extremely rare. They never tap the wrist of their rich funders. But it got to the point that the U.S. was actually censured by the ILO for using permanent replacement workers, which in the Caterpillar case, which violates all international labor standards. And in fact, the U.S. was urged to sort of accept international labor standards, which it doesn't. All right, this was outright conspiracy. The state federal government simply authorized the use of illegal methods, some of them flatly illegal methods, to attack and destroy and undermine unions. Well, they couldn't have gotten away with that earlier. Incidentally, here's another case where the left simply abandoned the terrain. Decatur workers were going around, of course they weren't covered in the press. Obviously you don't expect the corporate media to cover this stuff. But Decatur workers were really fighting. They all lost, incidentally. They got smashed. It was a total disaster, all three of them. And a big part of the reason for that was that the people who ought to be the left just didn't give a damn. Like in Boston, when Staley workers came to try to organize some support, we had a meeting for them, which ought to have been this many people. It's in the room where this many people show up for anything. There were 75 people. It's the first time I've talked I talked a lot at those meetings on every imaginable topic. This is the first time in about 20 years I haven't seen the place almost filled. Why? Well, just a bunch of, white males. Who cares about them? Working people from Decatur, Illinois, who are trying to preserve and restore and ultimately rebuild the American labor movement. Okay, those are the kind of guys who are going to be out in the militias pretty soon, or listening to Pat Buchanan. And I think we can partly blame ourselves for that, not insignificantly. But the point is, there were powerful weapons, and they're being used all over the world. The United States and Britain, first they were used to destroy the weaker working classes, like in Latin America. Latin America had pretty organized and powerful working classes, but they're much weaker societies. So they were just smashed by structural adjustment and so on. They're by now really devastated throughout the continent. In the industrial world, it's a tougher nut to crack, and it started with the United States and England. The United States and England are worst in this respect. That's the Thatcher-Reagan period. It's a big attack on working people, also on families, on children, it's across the board. And Europe and Japan are still kind of holding on. Canada's sort of in between. Somewhere between the United States and the Anglo-American model and the European-Japanese model. But in a more integrated global economy, it's going to be awful hard for anybody to hold out unless there is substantial popular resistance, because what's actually happening is most of the world is being turned into a kind of third world. You can see it's pretty dramatic in places like the United States and England, less so in continental Europe, but unless there's substantial resistance to this, that's pretty much what's going to happen. So layoffs is a piece of it, but it's a much bigger picture. And I don't think that the kind of talk that's coming out of Washington even relates to this issue. Asking corporations to be nicer, that's like a joke, In fact, there was, back around, like in the Kennedy years, around that period, there was a lot of talk about how corporations had changed. I remember one colleague of mine, who was in fact the head of the Institute for Advanced Studies and then was in the Kennedy administration at MIT, who's an economist, wrote a paper called The Soulful Corporation. The idea is that corporations have become soulful. They used to be kind of money grubbing and so on, but now and that is just ridiculous. If any corporation, here Milton Friedman and those guys are absolutely right. If a corporation tried to be anything but, really monsters, it would be basically illegal. They would not be fulfilling their responsibility to their shareholders. And furthermore, they would be eliminated. They'd be cut out of the market because somebody else wouldn't be soulful and would be making more money. This is institutional. It has nothing to do with anybody being nice. These are institutional facts. And as long as, it's like trying to ask, some totalitarian state to be more nice to its people. Well, it doesn't make sense. What you do with a totalitarian state is eliminate it. You don't ask it to be nicer to people. And these are totalitarian systems. A corporation is a totalitarian system, and by now they're very big ones. You know, they're huge command economies, which are internally modeled. I mean, they're just they have pretty much the structure of a totalitarian state. They unify the judicial, legislative, and executive functions in a top, unaccountable control system. The only accountability is to investors, which means other, banks and, big investment firms and so on. And the public accountability is limited to the regulatory system, which of course they're trying to destroy. So it's essentially a takeover of power by big totalitarian institutions, which incidentally, their roots are not are about the same as the other contemporary forms of totalitarianism, Bolshevism and fascism. They all come out of late 19th century, vaguely Hegelian ideas about organic entities having rights above individuals and so on and so forth. There's actually pretty good scholarly work on this, on the origin of 20th century. The corporations got their current power mostly in the early part of the century. They're not like sort of graven in stone. The rights of immortal persons with things like free speech and all that kind of stuff. That's early 20th century. And it was not granted by legislation either. It was done mostly by courts and lawyers and so on. And it's a form of totalitarianism, and you don't ask it to be more soulful any more than you ask Stalin to be more soulful. These are institutional structures. They behave the way they do. You have to eliminate them. And so these were truisms in the working class movements not very long ago. By now they sound really weird, but that's a sign of the victory of powerful propaganda systems, corporate propaganda systems. It's simply driven out of people's heads what used to be everybody's understanding. In fact, you go back to the early, a century ago, in the AFL, which is not particularly radical. These are the things people were talking about at the national meetings. Let's get rid of all these things, and working people ought to own the mills and run them. They build them, they work in them, they ought to run them. That was one of the big issues in the Homestead strike back in 1892. If it's been beaten out of people's heads, that's our problem. We ought to get it back in people's heads. It's not very strange, sort of natural and automatic, just like opposition to any other form of totalitarianism. And playing games about they should be nicer to people, that doesn't mean anything. Yeah, sure, if you can sort of impose by force, if you can use federal, say OSHA, if you can impose health and safety standards on them, fine, that's better than not having those standards, but there should be no illusions. That's like forcing a totalitarian state because of some countervailing force to act nicer. Okay, maybe you can do it, but that's not the answer. Oh, okay, yeah.
I consider myself to be a Machiavellian. Excuse me, your use of the word totalitarian is a boo term, and I'm not afraid.
It is, that's meant as a descriptive term.
Martin Kitchen, who wrote a book on fascism, calls it a boo term.
Who?
Martin Kitchen up at SFU. He wrote a book on fascism. Totalitarianism is a boo term. What you got to do is unpack the usage of the word totalitarianism. Machiavelli, if you look at Machiavellianism as Machiavellianism from above and from below, Bakunin has been called a Machiavellianism from below.
I think
we need more envious workers. We don't need sentimentality from Noam Chomsky.
This is nothing.
You're too sentimental about the workers. Oh, the poor little bleeding workers. Yeah, we need envy from below and greed from above. We're not going to get anything but greed from above. You've admitted that. But you want sentimentality from below.
No, I don't want sentimentality. I want struggle, freedom, justice, solidarity.
Well, what's wrong with envy?
Nothing wrong with that. And when incidentally, when I used the word totalitarian, I meant it. It's true I didn't say much about it, but when I was talking about centralizing the legislative, executive, and judicial functions in a top center, I was actually quoting I didn't say so because it wasn't time. But I was quoting from a pretty mainstream Veblenite political economist back when I was around the early 1940s, Robert Brady, who wrote a book on business as a system of power, in which he described quite well the way in which totalitarian institutions like corporations were developing in the industrial world with many counterparts to the fascist systems. There's more recent work. When I mentioned scholarship, I had something in mind too. There's a legal historian at Harvard, very good one, Morton Horowitz, who has two big fat books on the transformation of American law. And if you look at the second volume, he goes, which is the more, goes through, say, 1860 to 1920 or so. He talks about the origin of modern corporations and corporate law in exactly these terms. These are descriptive terms. They are not boo terms.
Okay, why can't we have something like Max Stirner's alliance of egoists from below?
Well, you can have it if you want, but that's not the world I want.
You want sentimentality and organicism of the poor and weak.
Well,
you want an organic,
what you call
communism, totalitarianism of the left wing.
Okay, I think we've exhausted this topic.
You want sentimentalism of the left wing, organicism of the left wing.
Okay.
Excuse me.
That's what it sounds like to you. Okay.
He cut me off. Thank you.
Yeah, this last one, I'm told. Sorry.
Thank you. Not long ago in this province, some changes were made in the legislation to make sterner penalties for things like distribution of hate literature in response to an increased perception of groups like the Aryan Nation and the Heritage Front. And while it's definitely important to preserve free speech, freedom of speech, it is also clear that the increased activity of such groups also needs to be addressed as well. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what thoughts you might have about what means could be done so apart from trying to make stricter penalties for distribution of hate literature.
Well, I'm against it. I don't think the state should have the power to decide what people think and say. Right. I don't want the state to have that power. And I think on the other, it's bad to have people running around with hate literature, but the way to do it is not to give power to some more dangerous entity like the state. What you have to do is meet them on, get to the people that they're reaching.
Right.
They are reaching people who are susceptible to this literature. Why? Well, for reasons of the kind I mentioned. Let's take the people who have been subjected to the social policies that we all know and which we just alluded to. Yeah, they're going to be frightened, angry. They're going to search for somebody to blame it on. They're going to be easy targets for hate literature, just as they were under the Nazis. Well, the way to deal with that was not to outlaw Mein Kampf. That wouldn't have changed a thing. It was to deal with the sources in the society for what Hitler was appealing to. And the same is true here. Incidentally, if you're worried about talk that harms people, picking out hate literature is a very odd choice. Yes, that harms people, but free market ideology harms them way more. If you want to know people who are really suffering, who's really suffering from the kind of IMF fundamentalism, which is mostly phony, but it's true that it's a dominant ideology, at least among elites. Well, go to, Africa or Latin America or poor slums in the United States, and you'll find people suffering, mostly women, incidentally, and suffering miserably, like mortality rates for women and infants have gone way up. Okay, hate literature hasn't done that. If you're worried about harming people, there are much more obvious candidates. And the answer to this is not to have the state powerful enough to stop people from talking about this stuff. That's not the answer.
I don't think I can say thank you any better than all of you have to Noam. Thanks very much on behalf of the BC Federation of Labour and the Vancouver and District Labour Council. And my thanks to all of you for being so patient.